Hello, my name is Michael Costello. I'm head of sustainability services here at BDO, and I'm delighted to be joined by Nik Gowing. Nik is a famous journalist, broadcaster, and author. So, Nik, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Michael.
Nik, we've been talking over the last couple of days with some of our colleagues about sustainability, what businesses can do to make themselves more sustainable, what they can do to help the sustainability agenda. You were, for many years, working on world affairs, big events that happened around the globe, particularly in Eastern Europe. What made you, or what interested you in getting involved in sustainability?
Yes, up until 2014, that's exactly what I was doing for many years in many of the revolutions around the world, seeing the Berlin Wall fall, being in all the revolutions in Eastern Europe apart from Romania, being in Russia, seeing what Russian troops leaving Afghanistan, Soviet troops in those days in 1988. And when I left the BBC, by choice, I have to say, in 2014, I realized that the world was changing and things were happening, not just Putin invading eastern Ukraine, but also seizing Crimea. People didn't really seem to understand. He'd been warning about this for a long time. So since then, I've been running a project called Thinking the Unthinkable, which goes back to the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, when President Kennedy had to be warned, Mr. President, you don't really realize this, but the Soviets already have nuclear tips on their torpedoes to break this US blockade of Cuba. So it's thinking differently, thinking the unthinkable, thinking the unpalatable. And that's what is necessary now, given the real threat to global sustainability, biodiversity, nature, the climate emergency as well. We've all got to be thinking much more radically, and I have to say much more ominously, about the way things are moving in terms of the survivability of us as a human race on this planet. I may sound like I'm being incredibly fatalistic and incredibly negative, but thinking the unthinkable is about thinking the unpalatable. You may not like the information, you may not like the data, but you've got to cope with it.
And you've had a good look at the data. And tell me, what's the science saying now versus what it was saying 5 years ago?
The science, as you're asking me to give you the answer on this, is being more ominous. The scientists have been warning for some considerable time about where things are going on the climate emergency, on sustainability, on biodiversity, on our disrespect for nature. But they're saying now, and here we are in the middle of 2024, they're saying now that the science they predicted is now even worse than they were warning about. It's moving much faster. The boundaries are being crossed of all our survivability, plus trigger points are being crossed and damaged. And in many ways, much of what is happening, floods, heat, everything else which is going on in Antarctica and Arctic, is underscoring the fact that we are now facing an existential crisis for us as human beings. It's all very well here sitting in Dublin. We can say we can survive temperatures of 45 or 50 degrees. We're big and we're strong and we're resilient. Actually, the human body can't stand those temperatures. And that, sadly, tragically, is what we're heading for. So you and I are sharing experiences, and also how companies, how corporates, anything from 5 people, an SME in other words, and a big company of 80,000 people, how together they can change their approach to the way they make money, do business, and hopefully make profits, and show that there's a positive way forward, not just doom and gloom.
And essentially, these are huge global issues. And for what can a company do? What can a individual leader do that can impact those global issues? And should they be just looking at making profit and surviving, or should they be looking at a different strategy, a different vision for their companies?
I run a small company myself, and so I'm familiar with the kind of constraints there are, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses. Cash flow, for example. If you're being faced with new regulations like CSRD from the European Union and other regulations which are coming in, which say you've got to declare stuff, you throw up your hands in horror and say, God, not more paperwork and so on. But that's the way things are moving. And what we've experienced here in the seminars that we've been doing here, and I see in many parts of the world, and certainly in the commercial sector, is people who are really worried that they can't embrace this. It's all too much for them, whether you're a company of 5 or a company of 50 or a company of 500. I have to say, and I can say this because I'm running a company, you've got to confront the new reality. Not be pessimistic or optimistic, but be functionally practical and say, this is what we've got to do. We've got to accept it's coming. How can we help? How can we help ourselves? And certainly there are those in the climate business and in the sustainability business who say, actually, there'll be more profit to be made from going green. Easy to say, and some companies are doing very well, but it's about changing the mindset. It's what I call introducing new mind muscle, to be energetic, to be nimble, to be reactive, and also to be ahead of the game and realize this is happening and you can't resist it.
And if this is new for everybody, the expertise isn't there within these companies.
Correct.
What can they do to understand best practice to get expertise? Where can they reach it for that?
Well, there's a temptation to just shut down and say, we'll keep going until it becomes a problem. I think that is completely the wrong approach. You've got to embrace this. You've got to find people who can support you. Come to companies like BDO, consultants like BDO, and say, what can we do? What can you do for me? Because I mean, you and I are sitting here talking about it, but we can't transmit to everybody. This is about reassuring leaders that actually there is a way forward, even if it's going to be bumpy, risky, and with a lot of twists and turns and a lot of uncertainty. Two big findings from all our work in the last 10 years. First of all, the conformity which qualifies you for a job, in fact, disqualifies you from understanding the scale of disruption and what you need to do about it. And secondly, the stability that we all take for granted, the linear way up of self-improvement, this stability we take for granted is no longer guaranteed. It is unraveling. And sadly to say, there are many politicians who are beginning to come to that, not just over Ukraine, but we're in a part of Europe where 60% of natural life has been eliminated. 60% has been eliminated, species and so on. That is a real shock, because what it means is the environment in which we're living has become unbalanced, is no longer balanced and stable within itself.
This is a shared problem. So do you think that that collaboration and working with competitors and working with other companies is the way to go? Is there a different approach than other business challenges?
Certainly learning from others, and that's what we've been doing here in a closed environment with, 16 people. It was fascinating watching them exchange experiences once they got over their fear about whether they were talking to in the presence of competitors and so on. They were sharing experiences and learning from each other. There's a lot to be said from listening to the stories of how companies, large and small, have coped with this. Some of them don't do well. Some of them face real liquidity problems, as we've just heard, facing the tax man breathing down your neck and demanding cash, cash, cash. But there are ways forward. It's not going to be easy for some people, but for others, it's about sharing the experiences, being positive, and seeing where there are solutions, even if it goes against the grain of what you were thinking about. We heard in a session not so long ago, one senior figure in a pretty predictable kind of business saying, I don't know what to do. I realize we're trundling along in second gear. We've got to get up to fifth gear, to which I said, but most gearboxes have 8 gears now. So, you've got to move in a way which is totally anathema to the way you've been thinking. And his response was, you're absolutely right. This has given me a lot of thought. So something like that, sharing experiences, even if it's an uncomfortable experience.
And tell me, what are the best companies doing?
Being honest about this. But I have to say, when you say the best companies, there's a real tension between making profit and being sustainable.
Yeah.
And in order to make a profit, there are those, not just in the fossil fuel business, there are those who will take a view that will just, frankly, do what we can while we can, make big money until something goes wrong. Are they being successful? Are they doing the right thing? No, in my view, because this is about adjusting the dynamics, adjusting the framework in which you're operating to a new reality. And this is what the new regulations coming in, the CSRD regulation particularly, is going to do. It's going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people. up to 1,100 data points, up to 1,100, most of which have never been thought about by big companies. They've got to be filled in, and there will be big fines in the European Union for organizations which don't actually comply with this. But why do I say this? Because it's about realizing that actually what we take for granted around us is no longer guaranteed, and we have to move in a particular direction. One example I've used is Nordisk, the big pharma company in Denmark. Fantastically successful, very profitable, one of the best CEOs in the business, big pharma company. They're doing fantastically well on type 2 diabetes with a new tablet for that. But on a platform at COP28 in Abu Dhabi, only 6 months ago, in other words, in November 2023, only 6 months ago, we heard on the platform, I was chairing this session, the sustainability manager for the company, a lady called Dorothea, say, we'd never, as a successful company, we'd never thought about nature and maybe the way we're abusing nature until a few months ago. That was staggering. But on the other hand, it's indicative of just how much learning there has to be done.
And how important is the role of leaders in these businesses
Vital.
for changing?
The role of leaders is vital. Because I believe very strongly it's not about saying company. It's about saying who's the leader and who is the leader who is going to change the thinking. It's about enlightenment. It's about changing the mindset. Getting back to that phrase, it's about creating new mind muscle. We can still be successful, but changing. But you haven't got 20 or 30 years to do this. You've probably got 20 or 30 months or 20 or 30 weeks. You've got to move very quickly. And that's got to be driven by someone right at the top, whether it be the CEO, COO, or the chairman of the board. And who's on that board? Well, we can debate that. But it's about finding new ways of doing things, new ways of thinking about stuff, and getting on with it and not leaving it in the hope it'll go away.
And if you were one of those CEOs now and you had a company that you were running, what would you do? What are the first steps you would take to try and address this within your company?
Well, I can laugh at your question, because if I was in that position, first of all, I wouldn't be in that position. But I think it's salutary to look at Unilever, where Paul Polman moved in that direction very strongly until he left as chief executive almost 5 years ago. He was replaced by Alan Jope, who kept the company moving in the same direction. But now there's a new chief executive who essentially wants to maximize profit. And these are my words, not his. Doesn't want to be distracted by the business of being too sustainable. Now, I don't say that critically, but it shows the reality of how the shareholders are putting pressure on a successful company like Unilever to increase returns, and increasing returns by offloading companies like Ben & Jerry's, which doesn't fit into the kind of formula that Unilever have. It's about how companies want to make money and whether they will make money by increasing profit and whether the shareholders will stick with them. It's a very live debate, and I'm not optimistic that actually things are going to move in the right direction. I think a lot of companies are facing massive challenges from shareholders, and look what's happened in several companies where there's been very activist shareholders at AGM meetings saying, we want you to make profit and dispense with anything which might get in the way of that principle.
So do you think that stakeholder capital will replace shareholder capital?
I think it should. Whether it will, I'm not convinced.
Yeah.
We are at a bend in the road. We are at a fork in the road. And while Nick Stern, author of the Stern Report from 18 years ago, says we know what we need to do, but I'm not sure we are going to do it. And so I'm not going to be optimistic, like Paul Polman in all his work on net positive, around his net positive organization. There's an aspiration for what needs to be done, but that doesn't that doesn't mean it's going to happen. Look what happened in Danone, where the chief executive was essentially dispensed with 3 years ago for being too sustainable, even for a big dairy company like Danone, because he was not making enough profit. That's brutal. And I see, with all the debate of wokeness and what's happening with BlackRock, saying, we're calming down, we're cooling our commitment to sustainability. There are plenty of investors who essentially want return and return now and not worry about the planet. I disagree with that, but that's the way there is a trend is going.
And what role do you see education, upskilling playing in what companies have to do?
Well, I think you use an important phrase there, upskilling. It's not about education. It's about recognizing that senior people have a skill, otherwise they're dispensed with. But it's about how you change that skill, modify it, and upskill, in other words, rather than education and training. I think if you tell people we're going to upskill you, that you're being far more encouraging than saying we're going to re-educate you or retrain you. Because actually what you're dealing with, particularly with the next generation, is people who've got great skills, but they need to be self-assured and reassured that the way they're doing things is going to improve and stands a better chance of saving the planet. I'm not a tree hugger, and are we talking about saving the planet? Yes, David Attenborough did a remarkable, before the war in Ukraine, he went to the Chernobyl disaster, to a town called Pripyat, which I've since been to since before just the war. And he said, look, you've got a place which was emptied of 50,000 people suddenly at the beginning of the nuclear disaster, and it is now overgrown. There are animals overgrown. This is what we're facing as a human race. What we did and what we've done will still be here, but we can't guarantee that we will be here as human beings to enjoy this planet. The planet will still be here, but maybe not with us on board. Look what's happening in India at the moment. Farmers are dying when the temperature is up to 50 degrees in their fields at 3 o'clock in the morning, because that's the only time when it's cool enough, not cool, it's hot, but cooler to be able to plant their seedlings and so on, yet it's still killing them. And that's tragically what we all face. We have to confront that. Business should be playing a part in ameliorating and mitigating the horrors of what is coming. And it's happening at a speed which the scientists say is far faster than they ever began to think about.
And finally, can I ask you, where would you point people for inspiration, for best practice? Where should they look to see this done well, that they can maybe implement the same things in their own companies?
I come back to the point I made a few minutes ago, Michael. In order to see how this can be done, you just need to cast your eye around, have discussions with people who are running companies who are changing, hearing and be encouraged by what they've done, how they've done it, how they've achieved, and how they've changed. That's where the kind of things we've been doing behind closed doors here at BDO are important, because it's a safe space in which experiences can be changed, whether they're optimistic experiences or perhaps more pragmatic instances. Hearing that you're not alone on this very difficult voyage, and realizing that you can't talk easily about 20 or 30 years. You've got to talk about 20 or 30 months or 20 or 30 weeks. We've still got to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 68% by 2030. By 2030, that is 6 years from now. We're up to about 6%. There's a long way to go. We all have to play a part.
Nik Gowing, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your views.